Welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been following this channel, you've probably noticed that some experiences don't feel random, even when they happen in completely ordinary situations. There is a moment that many people have had, and it usually appears without warning in the middle of something simple. You walk into a place you have never been before, or you hear someone say something for the first time, or you find yourself in a situation that should feel completely new. But instead of feeling new, something inside you reacts in a very specific and immediate way, and a clear thought appears in your mind. I've been here before. It does not feel like imagination, and it does not feel like guessing or confusion, because in that moment, the feeling is direct and certain, as if recognition happens before you have time to question it. And even though you know there is no logical reason for it, the sense of familiarity is still there, and it feels real. The moment is usually brief and easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But while it is happening, it can feel strong enough to interrupt your focus, because you might recognize the way the room is arranged, or the exact tone of someone's voice, or even what is about to happen next. And for a short time, everything seems known before it unfolds. Then, just as quickly as it appears, the feeling fades. And what remains is not clarity, but a quiet sense of confusion, because you are left with a simple question that does not have a clear answer. And that question tends to stay with you longer than the moment itself. How can something feel so familiar when you know it should not be? Most people call this déjà vu and move on without thinking too much about it, because it is common enough to be accepted as normal. And in many cases, it is explained as a small mistake in how the brain processes information, which makes it easy to dismiss and forget. But not every déjà vu moment feels the same. And this is where the experience becomes harder to ignore, because some of these moments carry a different kind of weight that is not easy to explain with a simple answer. In those moments, it is not just the place that feels familiar, and it is not just the sequence of events, but the entire situation feels known in a deeper way, including the timing, the emotional tone, and the sense that what is happening has already unfolded before, even if you have no clear memory of it. And when that happens, the question changes in a very direct way, because it is no longer just about why this feeling appears, but about what exactly you are recognizing in that moment. Is this only a small error in perception, or is it something that we do not fully understand yet? In this video, we are going to look at this experience step by step, not as something to dismiss quickly, but as something that may reveal a deeper pattern behind how memory, awareness, and recognition actually work. If you take a step back from a single moment of déjà vu and look at it more broadly, you begin to notice something important, which is that this experience is not rare, and it does not belong to a small group of people, because it shows up across different ages, different cultures, and completely different life situations in ways that are surprisingly consistent. Some people experience it while traveling to a place they have never visited before, where the environment should feel unfamiliar. Yet something about the layout, the atmosphere, or even the sequence of events feels known in a way that cannot be explained by memory alone. And this creates a brief pause where the present moment feels connected to something that is not clearly accessible. Others experience it in conversations, where a sentence begins and before it is finished, they already feel like they know exactly how it will end, not as a prediction or guess, but as a form of recognition that feels immediate and certain, even though there is no clear reason why that recognition should exist. There are also moments that happen in very ordinary routines, such as walking into a familiar place like a classroom, an office, or a street you pass through every day, where suddenly the situation shifts from normal to strangely familiar in a deeper way. As if the moment is not just repeating in a routine sense, but repeating in a way that feels layered and precise. Across all of these situations, the pattern begins to form, because even though the contexts are different, the structure of the experience remains the same. And that structure includes a few consistent features that are hard to ignore once you start paying attention. The first feature is that the experience is brief, often lasting only a few seconds, which makes it easy to dismiss or overlook, especially if you are focused on something else at the time. And this short duration is one of the reasons why it rarely gets examined in detail. The second feature is that it appears unexpectedly, without any clear trigger that you can identify, because it does not build up gradually, and it does not follow a predictable pattern in your daily life, which makes it feel disconnected from normal cause and effect. The third feature is that it carries a sense of certainty, even if that certainty does not last, because in the moment itself, there is no hesitation about whether the feeling is real, and even if you question it afterward, during the experience it feels direct and convincing. And finally, there is often an emotional layer that varies from neutral to slightly intense, where some moments feel almost insignificant, while others carry a subtle weight that makes them harder to ignore, even if you cannot explain why one moment feels different from another. When you begin to put these pieces together, it becomes difficult to treat déjà vu as a random or isolated event, because the repetition of the same structure across different situations suggests that there is some kind of underlying pattern, even if that pattern is not fully understood. This is where the perspective begins to shift, because instead of asking why a single moment feels strange, you start to notice that many people are describing the same type of experience using different words, which means that what feels personal may actually be part of something shared. And once you recognize that this experience repeats not just in your own life, but across many different people and situations, the idea that it is purely accidental becomes harder to hold on to, because patterns usually point to something that is consistent beneath the surface. So the question becomes more focused and more direct, because now it is no longer about one unusual moment, but about a repeating experience that follows the same structure across time, across context, and across different individuals. If this is a pattern, then what exactly is repeating? And why does it appear in such a consistent way? Once you begin to see déjà vu as a repeating pattern rather than a single strange moment, a deeper problem starts to appear. And that problem is not about what happens during the experience, but about the contradiction that sits at the center of it. On one side, there is logic, which tells you clearly that the situation is new, because you can verify that you have never been in this exact place before. You have never had this exact conversation, and there is no recorded memory that connects you to what is happening in that moment. On the other side, there is the experience itself, which feels just as clear but in a completely different way, because instead of presenting evidence, it presents recognition, and that recognition does not feel uncertain or vague, but immediate and direct, as if something inside you already knows what is unfolding. These two sides do not align, and that is where the tension comes from, because you are left holding two conclusions at the same time, one based on what you can prove, and the other based on what you feel, and neither one cancels the other out. You cannot fully accept the experience as memory, because there is no past event to support it. But you also cannot fully dismiss it as an illusion, because the clarity of the recognition does not feel like a simple mistake. And this creates a kind of internal conflict that does not resolve easily. This is why déjà vu often leaves behind a lingering question, even after the moment has passed, because it challenges something very basic about how we understand memory, which is the idea that memory always comes from something that has already happened. If memory is supposed to be a record of the past, then how can you recognize something that has no clear place in your past? Some explanations try to solve this by focusing only on the brain, suggesting that what you are experiencing is a small delay or overlap in how information is processed, where the present moment is briefly registered twice, creating the illusion of familiarity. And while this explanation can account for some cases, it does not fully address the intensity or clarity of certain experiences. Because in many instances, the feeling is not just that something is repeated, but that something is known, and that sense of knowing carries a different quality than a simple processing error, especially when it includes specific details, timing, or emotional tone that feel too precise to be random. This is where the contradiction becomes harder to ignore, because the more clearly you remember how the moment felt, the more difficult it becomes to reduce it to a simple glitch. And yet, without a clear explanation, you are left with a gap between what you experienced and what you can explain. So the question starts to shift again, becoming more focused and more difficult at the same time. Because instead of asking whether the experience is real or not, you begin to ask what kind of experience it actually is. Is it possible that recognition does not always depend on past events in the way we assume? Is it possible that the feeling of familiarity can exist without a clear origin in memory as we normally understand it? And if that is the case, then what does that say about how memory and awareness are connected? At this point, the experience of déjà vu is no longer just a curiosity, because it begins to point toward a deeper issue, which is that our current understanding of time, memory, and recognition may not fully explain everything we experience. And when a simple moment raises questions that cannot be answered within the usual framework, it creates an opening, not for belief, but for a different way of looking at the same experience. At this point, instead of trying to force the experience of déjà vu into the limits of what we already understand, it becomes useful to look at it from a different angle, not as something that needs to be explained away quickly, but as something that may reveal a gap in how we think about time, memory, and awareness. This is where the perspective associated with Edgar Cayce offers a different way to approach the same experience, not as a fixed explanation, but as a lens that allows us to reconsider what déjà vu might represent if our assumptions about time and memory are incomplete. In Cayce's view, time is not always experienced in a strictly linear way, where everything moves step by step from past to present to future in a clean sequence. But instead, awareness may move through different layers of experience that are not always arranged in that simple order, which suggests that what we call the present moment may not be as isolated as it seems. If time is not strictly linear, then memory may not be limited to events that we consciously remember in sequence, because it could exist as patterns or impressions that are not always tied to a clear timeline. And this opens the possibility that recognition can occur even when we cannot trace it back to a specific past event. From this perspective, déjà vu is no longer treated as a mistake in perception, but as a moment where awareness comes into contact with something that already exists in a different form, not as a detailed memory with a clear story, but as a pattern that feels familiar without context. This idea does not require you to assume that you have lived the exact same moment before in a literal sense, and it does not depend on dramatic interpretations, because it focuses instead on the structure of the experience itself, which is recognition without explanation, familiarity without a visible source. In this way, déjà vu becomes a moment where two layers briefly overlap, the layer of present awareness and the layer of stored patterns that are not fully accessible to conscious thought. And when these layers align for a short time, the result is a feeling that something is known even though it cannot be clearly recalled. This helps explain why the experience feels so specific in the moment, but becomes difficult to describe afterward, because what you are recognizing is not a complete memory that can be put into words, but a partial alignment that fades as soon as the moment passes. It also explains why some déjà vu experiences feel stronger than others, because if the overlap between these layers is more precise, the sense of familiarity becomes more intense, and the recognition feels more convincing, even though it still lacks a clear explanation. From this point of view, the question is no longer whether the experience is real or not, because the experience itself is clearly real in how it is felt, but rather what kind of process could create a moment where recognition appears without a clear source. Cayce's interpretation suggests that what we call memory may not be limited to what we can consciously recall, and that awareness may have access to patterns that exist beyond our immediate understanding, which means that familiarity could come from a level of experience that we do not normally access in everyday thinking. This does not force a belief, and it does not ask you to accept a fixed conclusion, because it simply offers a way to look at the same experience from a different angle, where the contradiction between logic and feeling is not ignored, but reinterpreted as a sign that something else may be involved. When you look at déjà vu through this lens, the experience starts to shift from being a small error to being a brief moment of contact with something that is not fully visible. And while that does not provide a complete answer, it does change the direction of the question. Instead of asking why the brain makes mistakes, you begin to ask what kind of structure could allow recognition to appear without a clear memory, and whether that structure might extend beyond the way we usually think about time and experience. When you move beyond a single explanation and begin to look at how this experience appears across different people and situations, a broader pattern starts to become visible. And this pattern is not limited to isolated moments of déjà vu, but extends into other forms of familiarity that follow a similar structure. Some people describe entering a place for the first time and immediately feeling a strong sense of recognition that goes beyond visual familiarity, where it is not just the layout or the environment that feels known, but the atmosphere itself, as if the space carries a quality that they have encountered before, even though they have no memory of being there. Others describe meeting someone new and experiencing an immediate sense of familiarity that does not match the reality of the situation, where the connection feels established from the beginning, not in a social or emotional sense alone, but in a way that suggests a kind of recognition that appears without a clear cause. There are also cases where people find themselves drawn to specific places, activities, or interests without being able to explain why. And when they finally encounter those things directly, the experience feels less like discovery and more like returning to something that was already known, even if that knowledge was never consciously formed. Across these different examples, the same structure begins to repeat, because the experience is not built on clear memory, but on a sense of familiarity that appears without a visible source. And this similarity suggests that déjà vu may be part of a larger pattern rather than a separate phenomenon. In many of the documented cases associated with Edgar Cayce, there are descriptions of individuals encountering situations that feel familiar in ways they cannot explain. And while the details vary from case to case, the underlying pattern remains consistent, which is that recognition appears before conscious memory can account for it. Some of these accounts involve people reacting strongly to specific environments, where the emotional response seems out of proportion to the present situation, as if something deeper is being activated. And this aligns with the idea that familiarity may not always be tied to conscious recall. Other cases describe moments where individuals anticipate events or responses without clear reasoning, not as predictions formed through analysis, but as immediate impressions that feel certain in the moment. And while these impressions are not always accurate, the experience of recognition still follows the same structure. What becomes clear when these cases are viewed together is that the experience is not random in its form, even if it appears unpredictable in when it occurs, because the same elements continue to appear across different contexts, including sudden recognition, lack of clear memory, and a brief but convincing sense of familiarity. This consistency is important because patterns that repeat across individuals and situations usually point to something that operates beneath the surface level of conscious thought, even if that underlying process is not fully understood. It also helps explain why déjà vu can feel so personal while still being widely shared, because each individual experiences it in a different context. But the structure of the experience remains the same, which creates a connection between personal perception and a broader pattern. From this perspective, déjà vu is no longer just a moment that happens occasionally, but part of a larger category of experiences where familiarity appears without a clear source. And this category includes not only brief flashes of recognition, but also longer-lasting impressions that influence how people respond to certain places, people, or situations. When you begin to see these connections, the idea that déjà vu is only a minor error becomes less complete, because it does not fully account for the range of experiences that share the same structure. And this opens the possibility that what we are observing is part of a more complex process. This does not mean that every experience of familiarity has the same origin, or that all cases should be interpreted in the same way. But it does suggest that there is a repeating pattern that deserves closer attention, especially when it appears in forms that cannot be easily reduced to simple explanations. So instead of asking whether a single moment can be explained, the focus shifts toward understanding why this structure appears so consistently across different people and different situations, and what kind of underlying process could produce the same type of experience in so many different forms. Before moving further into interpretation, it is important to look at how modern psychology and neuroscience approach the experience of déjà vu, because any explanation that aims to be complete needs to account for what is already understood about how the brain processes memory and perception. One of the most common explanations is that déjà vu may result from a small mismatch in how the brain processes incoming information, where a moment is briefly registered twice through slightly different pathways, creating the impression that the second registration is a memory rather than a current experience. And this can produce a short but convincing sense of familiarity. Another explanation suggests that there may be a delay between perception and conscious awareness, where the brain processes a situation before you become fully aware of it. And when that awareness catches up, the information feels familiar because it has already been processed at a level that you did not consciously notice. There are also theories related to memory systems, where the brain mistakenly identifies a new situation as something that resembles a stored pattern, even if the match is incomplete. And this partial similarity can trigger a sense of recognition that feels real, even though it is based on an error in classification rather than a true memory. These explanations are useful because they show that the brain is capable of creating familiarity without an actual past event, and they help explain why déjà vu is often brief, unpredictable, and difficult to reproduce on demand, since it may depend on subtle timing or processing conditions that are not under conscious control. In many everyday cases, these explanations seem sufficient, especially when the experience is light, neutral, and quickly forgotten, because a small processing overlap or delay could reasonably account for a momentary feeling that does not carry deeper meaning. However, not all experiences of déjà vu feel the same, and this is where the psychological explanation begins to show its limits, because some moments carry a level of clarity or emotional weight that does not easily fit into the idea of a simple processing error. In those cases, the experience is not just a brief sense of familiarity, but a more defined feeling of recognition that includes specific details, timing, or emotional tone. And this creates a distinction between different types of déjà vu that may not all have the same origin. Some experiences feel shallow and easy to dismiss, while others feel more precise and harder to ignore. And this difference suggests that what we are grouping under one term may actually include multiple processes that produce similar but not identical effects. From a psychological perspective, this raises an important question, which is whether all familiarity can be explained through the same mechanism, or whether different layers of experience are involved depending on the intensity and structure of the moment. It also highlights the role of perception and interpretation. Because even if the brain creates the initial feeling, the meaning that we assign to that feeling can vary depending on how we understand it. And this means that the experience itself may be simple in some cases and more complex in others. When you place the psychological explanations alongside the perspective we explored earlier, the picture becomes more balanced, because instead of choosing between a purely neurological cause and a broader interpretation, it becomes possible to see that both may describe different aspects of the same experience. Some moments may be explained fully by how the brain processes information, while others may involve patterns that are not fully captured by current models. And the challenge is not to replace one explanation with another, but to recognize where each explanation applies and where it may fall short. So the question is no longer about which explanation is correct in every case, but about how different types of experiences can exist under the same label, and what distinguishes a simple moment of familiarity from one that feels more structured and meaningful. When you place all of these perspectives side by side, including the repeating pattern, the internal contradiction, the alternative lens, and the psychological explanations, a clearer insight begins to form. And that insight does not depend on choosing one explanation over another, but on recognizing what they all point toward. The central idea is simple, but it changes how you interpret the experience, which is that familiarity may not always come from the past that you consciously remember, and recognition may not always depend on a clear, traceable memory. In everyday thinking, we tend to assume that if something feels familiar, it must be because we have experienced it before in a way that we can recall. But déjà vu challenges this assumption by presenting familiarity without recall, which means the feeling appears without the supporting structure we expect. This suggests that recognition may operate at a level that does not require full awareness, where patterns can be registered and accessed without forming a complete memory that can be described or retrieved in detail. And this would explain why the experience feels real but remains difficult to explain afterward. It also helps explain why some moments feel stronger than others. Because if recognition depends on how closely a present situation aligns with a stored pattern, then a closer alignment would produce a stronger sense of familiarity, even if the source of that pattern is not consciously available. From this point of view, déjà vu becomes less about memory in the traditional sense, and more about pattern recognition that operates beneath the level of conscious recall, where the mind responds to structures it has encountered before, even if those structures are not linked to a clear narrative. This does not require the idea that every moment has happened before in an exact way, and it does not depend on a single explanation for all cases, because it allows for multiple layers of experience, where some moments are simple processing effects and others involve deeper forms of recognition. What matters is not the specific cause in each case, but the pattern that appears across them, which is that the feeling of familiarity can exist independently of clear memory, and that recognition can occur without a full understanding of where it comes from. This shifts the focus away from trying to prove whether the experience is real or not, because the experience itself is already real in how it is felt, and instead places the focus on understanding what kind of process allows recognition to appear without a clear source. It also changes how you respond to the experience, because instead of dismissing it as meaningless or treating it as something that must be explained immediately, you can begin to see it as a signal that points to how the mind processes patterns beyond what is immediately visible. In this sense, déjà vu becomes less about the past and more about how recognition works in the present, because it shows that the mind can identify something as familiar even when the pathway to that familiarity is not accessible. And once you see it this way, the experience no longer feels like a contradiction that needs to be resolved, but like an example of how perception and memory may operate in ways that are more complex than we usually assume. When you bring this idea back into everyday life, the experience of déjà vu starts to connect with other situations that may not be labeled the same way, but follow a similar structure, where something feels familiar even though you cannot clearly explain why. One of the most common examples appears in relationships, where you meet someone for the first time, but the interaction does not feel new, and instead of building familiarity over time, there is an immediate sense that you already understand the dynamic, the tone, or even how certain situations between you might unfold. This does not always mean that the connection is positive or meaningful in a simple way, because sometimes the familiarity appears in patterns that repeat, such as entering similar types of relationships, facing the same kinds of conflicts, or responding in ways that feel automatic, even when you are aware that the outcome may not change. In these cases, the sense of familiarity is not tied to a single moment, but to a pattern that continues over time, where different situations carry the same structure, and this creates a feeling that you have been here before, not in a literal place, but in a repeating experience. A similar pattern can appear in decisions, where you find yourself choosing between options that seem different on the surface but lead to similar results. And even when you try to change your approach, there is often a moment where the situation feels familiar before the outcome fully unfolds. There are also experiences connected to places, where certain environments feel immediately comfortable or recognizable, while others feel unfamiliar even after repeated exposure. And this difference is not always explained by how often you have been there, but by how the environment aligns with something internal. In all of these situations, the same structure appears again, which is recognition without a clear, conscious memory. And this suggests that the mechanism behind déjà vu may not be limited to brief moments, but may also operate in longer patterns that shape how we experience different parts of life. When you look at it this way, déjà vu becomes one expression of a broader process, where familiarity acts as a signal that something in the present aligns with something that has been registered before, even if that registration is not accessible in a direct or detailed way. This does not mean that every feeling of familiarity carries a deeper meaning, and it does not suggest that every repeated pattern has a hidden explanation beyond what we can observe. But it does show that the experience of recognition can extend beyond isolated moments into ongoing patterns. And when those patterns repeat across different areas of life, the sense of "I've been here before" begins to take on a more practical meaning, because it reflects how certain structures continue to appear, even when the context changes. So instead of seeing déjà vu as a rare and disconnected event, it becomes possible to see it as part of a larger pattern of recognition that shows up in moments, in relationships, in decisions, and in environments, all following the same basic structure.